Welcome everyone. Welcome to episode 8 of the Capital Analyst, and I'm your host Prabal Gupta. Today we have with us Ekansh Mittal. Ekansh is the founder of Catalyst Wealth. He started the firm in 2011 as an independent equity research service provider. He also currently manages two small cases under the names Alpha and Alpha Plus. He describes his investment strategy as growth come value investing. Ekansh took to stock picking very early in his life, owing to his parents' interest in financial markets, and has been successfully beating the market ever since. Welcome to the show, Ekansh. How are you doing?
Yeah, thank you, Prabal. Thank you for having me on your show. I hope it's a learning experience for your viewers, and we get to interact well over the next 1 hour or so.
Definitely. I think everyone would be excited to know your views. So let's kickstart the discussion. So, like recently, as you're aware, Twitter is filled with people talking about stocks and what is happening in financial markets, especially after COVID hit and everyone took to investing in markets. So one tweet I saw on Twitter said that a senior fund manager was saying that when I was asked in an interview early on in my life that why do I want to work in financial markets, he simply said that because I want to earn money and make money for myself. So what is your reason for choosing this path and starting your own firm in 2011?
So, frankly, just to give you a background, my family has been investing in markets since probably 80s, late 80s. So my father was a member of UP Stock Exchange. He was a broker there. So we always had these companies' annual reports like coming to our home, and we used to have discussions. Like my father used to talk a lot about companies like say Cipla, Dr. Reddy's, because those had been great wealth creators for him. So it wasn't anything new for us. Like normally, there's not much talk about investing at homes, and not so much about stock market. But it was very common for us too. So in fact, for me, if I remember vividly, it was probably I think around 2098 or 2000 when this car was launched, Tata Indica. So there was a huge rush for this car, huge demand, and I think the car was being sold in black. So it just crossed my mind. I thought, there's huge demand, so we should probably buy some stock of the company. So I might be 11 or 12 at that point of time, and I asked my father why don't we buy? And he bought some shares. Just as a token kind of a thing, and just to like give me encouragement about that. So that's where probably the journey started. But yeah, this thing has been there, and normally you don't get economic times at your home, right? In most homes, but we always had that economic times. And even my father used to tell me like, okay, look at this page here, and you'll find some details like P ratios, RONW. Although I did not understand much of it, but yeah, he just told me like you could filter the stocks based on these parameters. So that was always there. So I think even though I did my BTech, but I think probably in the second or first year of BTech itself, I probably lost interest, and I had already started researching on companies in my own small way, very small companies, and yeah, and then things happened one after the other. And I started writing for a company, for a startup, and I was writing some blog notes while I was still in third year of my BTech, and that's how I eventually I started my own firm in 2011.
That's quite interesting, Ekansh. So, like, given that now you mentioned that your family has been investing since the 80s, and you picked up stock picking very early as well in your life, thanks to the atmosphere in your home. So, how have you observed some changes in how your parents invested in stocks and how you right now, after 10 years of experience running a professional firm, are investing? Have you seen a change in mindset when it comes to investing in markets across your own family and how you do it right now?
So I won't say much change in what our thought process has been. Our thought process has always been like identifying small, mid-sized companies in their growth stage and at reasonable valuations. So that has always been the case, because even when my father used to talk about certain companies, we always used to look at the growth, the graphs. Cipla used to have those growth graphs. Okay, the turnover is increasing each year. And then we also used to talk about valuations in very basic terms like PE and all. So that has always been ingrained, this growth come value investing. So that per se, I would say hasn't changed much. But I would say, I mean, for me, there has been a lot of learning experiences. I mean, because although we were investing and my father was investing, but we also had some bad experiences in terms of I mean, unfortunately, a few mistakes that happened. So if I were to talk about that, like there was a case wherein there was probably over concentration in the portfolio in few stocks. And there was also a case where he had like pledged his shares. He had availed some loan for some business. And then, if I remember it right, and unfortunately, this Pokhran nuclear test happened, or something of that, wherein all the stocks kind of crashed because there were restrictions from US, trade restrictions, and all that, and we lost a lot of stuff in that. I mean, all the shares, because when you pledge your shares and then you have to put up margin money, and if you're not able to do that, the banks sell off your shares. So even though we had good companies, good stocks, but my father, in fact, lost a lot of wealth in that. And so that was a learning experience for me. I mean, I thought I probably would be cautious. I mean, it's like learning from mistakes. So I thought I'll be cautious, even though the strategy was still the same, growth come value investing. But I thought I'll probably be more diversified. I wouldn't ever take the step of, like, say, pledging my shares or too much leverage. So I think that's been the only change when I look at my own strategy. But the overall, the main concept still remains the same. And even then, we used to look for companies which are not so much talked about in the market. And those were, I mean, and even now we are looking at only those kind of companies which are easy to understand, where the market is still not talking about, the institutional interest is very low. So that has kind of remained same, more or less.
So since talking about this strategy of growth come value investing, so can you elaborate for us, like, what exactly do you mean when you say growth come value investing, and what are these two aspects of growth and value that we are talking about here?
See, basically, I mean, when you are doing fundamental analysis and when you are investing in businesses and trying to understand the business part, most of the investing is value investing. So normally there are two ways to look at value. So one value could be wherein, I mean, you are not looking at a company in terms of growth. I mean, there could be just like, say, Ben Graham used to talk about. There's an asset which you think is, say, has a value of, say, 100 odd crores, but somehow, due to the markets being bad or due to some problems being with the industry or the company, that asset is available at, say, 50 crore. And you believe that due to some trigger, or maybe not any trigger, the value could again go up to 100 crore or 80 crore or 90 crore. So that is one part of value investing, wherein you are not exactly looking at growth, but you are just looking at the arbitrage, the difference in value. Now, so that wherein the value 100 crore itself is not growing per se, but you are only looking at the ROE. But when I talk about, say, growth come value investing, what I mean is that I'm trying to look at company wherein this 100 crore value itself of the asset is growing, wherein I believe the earnings of the company, that have the potential to grow. The company is generating decent return on capital employed, so that whatever earnings it's generating, it is again able to redeploy on building, say, new assets, on creating new investments, which would further create more value. So what I'm trying to do here is that I'm trying to foresee whether this 100 crore value can become 200 crore or not. And in that case, I'm not necessarily trying to buy at 50 crore. I may buy at 100 crore itself, which is the current value. But if I am foreseeing that this company's asset value can be 200 crore due to due to the inherent potential in the business, or due to whatever investments the company is making. So that again is a value investing, because you are looking at the future value, which of course is uncertain, but obviously you are doing analysis and you are trying to do the business analysis part. You are trying to understand the track record of the management, or what kind of investment they have done to ensure that this value grows further. So therein you are not necessarily buying at, say, 50 crore. You are buying at 100 crore, and sometimes you may even overpay a bit, say 110 crore, but eventually you believe that this could become 200 crore. So that is the growth come value investing that I look at.
Got it. So linking this with your previous answer, where you said that you look for companies that are not much talked about, that are not yet in the limelight, and not every investor is not madly chasing behind them, because you want to get in early. So there are two parts to this strategy, the way I look at it. First is identifying these companies, because since they're not much talked about, it's harder to get a hold of these companies. And then is to analyze these companies and see whether it is worth investing in or not. So talking about the first part, so how do you go about approaching these companies that are not yet that have not yet generated that much market frenzy in the first place?
So I think, frankly, it has become a lot easier now. I mean, I would say even like say 10 years back, or like even much before that, it was much more, much more difficult. Now you have all these tools. I mean, there's a wonderful tool by the name of Screener. Then there's a website by the name of Tejori. And then also a lot of other tools are coming up, like Ticker and all, wherein you could put up certain parameters. And as an investor, you could always, it's creating a basic query wherein you are, say, looking at, okay, the sales growth for the last few years should be this much, the ROE, ROC should be this much. I mean, you could always tinker around with those parameters depending on what your objective is. And then you could always put up the parameter, okay, the market cap range of the company should be, say, 100 crore or below 1,000 crore or below 2,000 crore, right? So that way you are already getting a list of companies, say 50, 100 odd, depending on the screen that you are in. And then you are again looking at each company individually. Sometimes you see a company, you look at the certain numbers and you decide, okay, I mean, within 2 minutes, you are able to decide, okay, I mean, I'm not interested in that company. Similarly, there could be a company where you are not exactly sure of what the business is, or you don't understand the industry at all, so you skip that. At the same time, there could be companies where the numbers might look interesting initially, and you add them to your watch list so that you could do further research. So this is one way of scouting for ideas, which has now become very easy over the last few years. Earlier, one used to look at, there was a magazine by the name Capital Mind, not Capital Market. So, and then there were also tools by Capital Market and AS Equity, but those were quite expensive for a general investor or retail investor to buy subscription of. So, I mean, you would look at corporate announcements. So besides running these tools like Screener and Tejori and Ticker and all, we also look at daily corporate announcements. So the companies, I mean, they have to make announcements to the exchanges or whatever latest developments are happening. So we try and go through those announcements on daily basis. And a lot of times, new ideas come up from that space as well. I mean, there could be some announcement where the company may be saying we have launched this product, or you also get quarterly results. So you also screen the companies on the basis of that. I mean, you could simply screen the company on the basis of companies which may have shown good quarterly growth year on year or on sequential basis. So nowadays, a lot of tools have come up for screening the companies.
Got it. And now coming to the second part of the question. So let's say you have drilled down a query and you have drilled down a list of companies that you are interested to look at. But from my personal experience, what I have seen is that especially tools like Screener and Ticker Tape and all these kind of websites, they give you so many metrics that at times it becomes an information overload. Like they'll give you all these kind of ratios, financial data going back past 10 years, cash flow statement, balance sheet, and everything. So what are the key metrics that you focus on to come up with an investment rationale that these are the key things that I'm interested in, and if these are doing well for the company, I might put in some money there?
So again, you'll have to form your own buckets. I mean, as rightly pointed out by you, I mean, there's information overload. There is so much data. When you look at even any company, there'll be so many ratios. There'll be past 10 years data. There'll be quarterly results data and annual results. So you'll have to form your own bucket as to what exactly you're looking for. I mean, we call it pattern recognition. So, I mean, since we have been investing for a reasonable amount of time, you kind of develop and start understanding patterns. Okay, these are cyclical companies. These are cyclical businesses. They won't have linear growth in, say, sales or profits. They would have periods of good growth, then they would have bad times, and then again, they would have good periods. So you form one bucket of cyclical companies. And then when you are looking at the data, or when you have screened companies on the basis of cyclicality, you would try and look at, for instance, if I'm looking at a cyclical company or cyclical business, commodity business, I would try and look at those companies which are currently not doing good. So the idea is, because these are cycles, they will go through good phase and bad phase. So the idea for cyclical companies, if I could get them during their bad phase, I may not exactly know when the good phase will come, but if the balance sheet is strong, eventually it might come 2 years, 3 years down the line. And then I'll have a good run up in the stock, wherein it could go 200, 300% or whatever. So if I'm looking at cyclical company, the main things that I would look at is how are the current margins of the company, whether the gross margins or the operating margins, because normally you would find, very important metric. If we look at say metal companies, they'll have periods. I mean, a good metal company could have say a 30% EBITDA margin during a very good period, while it may go down to say 4% or even losses during bad periods. So although this is counterintuitive, but I would rather invest when probably there are losses in the company. So that is one bucket of investment that we do. Then there could be another bucket wherein you are looking at companies which are having a secular growth record, wherein there's a year-on-year growth in sales, year-on-year. There's some the margins of the company are improving. The company hasn't done any dilution at all. The company's balance sheet looks strong. Their working capital cycle doesn't seem to have deteriorated. So normally these companies are very widely tracked these days, and if there's a good growth story which with all these positive things, you won't normally get it at very reasonable valuations. There was a time, and it also happens during say a March 20 correction when all the stocks went down. So you could pick up such great good businesses at reasonable valuations when the markets go through a very bad period, because no matter what, even such companies get beaten down. And then there's also a bucket that we look at where the company might be overall good. No cyclicality in general, but there are always periods when things go temporarily bad. For markets, what is temporarily bad is if the earnings go down. If the profits have come down from say 100 crore to 80 crore, even though there hasn't been much change in the business and the business is still on the growth path, the markets may not like it, because in general markets tend to like stories which are constantly growing. And therein you could get a good opportunity. You try and do some analysis and determine, okay, this is a temporary phase for the company. The profits have come down temporarily, and again the company will be on the growth path. So these are the kind of three major buckets that we look at. And once you have determined the bucket, it becomes easy to look for the patterns or what exactly you're looking for.
Got it. So what the trend that I have observed is that generally there are two pivots to growth for any company. One is earnings growth, which you have talked about, is that if the earnings are growing consistently year on year. And second is something called PE re-rating, which is like expansion in the PE multiple that you also talk about in your strategy, especially with small and mid cap stocks. So I want to understand what exactly is this PE re-rating? Does there need to be a trigger in the market for the PE of the stock to get re-rated? How do we anticipate at this point of time that there would be a multiple expansion going forward? So if you can simplify, what exactly do you mean by PE re-rating?
Yeah, so there are multiple. So when I talked about why do we look at small companies in general format, so the primary idea is, small companies, because of their overall small size, a lot of times institutions are not interested in those companies because they are managing 5,000, 10,000 odd crore. And herein you have a 200 crore market cap company. If they have to buy a reasonable stake, it won't make any changes to their overall portfolio, right? So, the companies are not widely tracked. And that's why, even though it might happen that the company is doing well, it's reporting overall year-on-year growth, and you still see that there's a good, probably the path ahead for the company is still good because the market might be good, the market might be expanding. The company, even though small, but it could still be the leader in its respective segment. It could be within the top 2-3 segments. And it may have a good growth path, but because the institutions are not following, or there's a not wide following for the company, you may get it at say 10, 12 times earnings. Right, which is if you see normally, it's a reasonable valuation, assuming that there's a good growth path for the company and the business is good. But what happens eventually as the company reaches a certain scale? Once, if the profits have say moved from 220 odd crore to 100 odd crore, right, or say 50 odd crore, it starts coming within the radar of big HNI investors. We have a lot of investors who have massive amount of money to invest in. So they kind of also start looking at such companies, which they may not have been able to do when the company was say only 100 or 200 odd crore. So once the company's size starts increasing from say 200 odd crore to 500 or 1,000, first the big HNI start coming in. Then you have these institutions, because then those companies again start coming under their own radar. they can probably now invest say 1% or 2% or 5% in such companies. So if the company is is showing good growth consistently, I mean, then you have these series of PE re-ratings, wherein what happens, a 10-12 stock which might be quoting at 10-12 P, it could become a 20 P. I have seen stocks quoting at 8-9 times earnings, and now which are quoting at 40-50 times earnings. While over the last 10 years, their earnings may have grown only at say what, 5-6 times. So overall, what you're getting is 5 into 5, 25 times on the stocks in 10 years. So that's how this PE re-rating happens. I mean, if the business shows sustainability and consistency, and once it attains a certain size, I mean, this PE re-rating has happened with a lot of companies.
Got it. So, in like to sum it up, you are saying that it's like when the growth story becomes more visible and bigger investors enter into that stock or start taking notice, that is when the broader market takes notice and the PE re-rating happens.
Yeah. I mean, basically, that's a broader point, because initially, when the company is small, I mean, institutions cannot take part in that. They cannot allocate big sums. But when there is a consistency and sustainability of earnings, I mean, institutions start coming in, and that's where, I mean, it also starts getting attraction. What happens? I mean, when an institution enters a stock, it gets wider visibility amongst the investors as well. And that's where, I mean, we have seen a lot of companies getting PE rated from 8-10 times to 25, 30, 40 times.
So, like, while this offers you an opportunity to make great returns, but this is also something that can take a lot of time, and this is something that is more or less beyond your control and beyond the control of that company. So, like, how do you approach investing in these companies? Like, what is your holding period, and how much time do you give before you see whether PE rating is due or not?
So PE re-rating is not something that we are looking for in general. I mean, if it happens, and it's good for us. It overall amplifies our return. But overall, what we are looking for is the performance of the company and whether it's on the growth path or not. I mean, even if the PE doesn't re-rate and if the company is able to double its earnings in 4 years, I'm still getting 20% CAGR on my stock. And or say if the company is able to double its earnings in 5 years, I'm getting 15% CAGR, which is decent. Although I would like to aim for 26% or more, which is 3 years and double. But without PE re-rating, I'm still like doubling my money in 3 to 5 years, right? And if PE re-rating happens, that's like a cherry on the cake. So normally, if you're able to enter it, and what happens, it also happens with the market conditions as well. I mean, PE even may get derated. I mean, there was a period from say 2018 to 2020, right? A lot of companies, small mid caps, all the stocks got beaten down because, I mean, firstly, I mean, they had already risen a lot in the 2014 to 18 market run up, and then their P's contracted for some companies. So while the companies were still doing good, the P's contracted and you were kind of making not so great returns. And now we have this like huge bull run since 2020, and almost all the stocks are getting re-rated. So this is also a function of how the markets are there. But what I'm talking about is the sustainability of this re-rating, because in a bull market, a lot of stocks will get re-rated, right? But a lot of those stocks will also come crashing down if the business is cyclical, if the business doesn't have that sustainability or consistency. So when we talk about re-rating, we are also talking about the sustainability and consistency of it, whether the business quality is good over the various cycles or not.
So what you're saying is that what you're aiming for is strong earnings growth and sustainability of the company, and if that leads to a PE rating, that's just an additional lever of growth for your investment.
Yeah, so that is one aspect that I talked about, which is a secular growth. We also, as I talked about, there is cyclical growth that we now look at. I mean, we were not looking at it much earlier, but over the last few years, as I talked about commodities business, metals or whatever, those are cyclical. There will be periods they'll go up and they will come crashing down. A lot of times they come crashing down 60-70% odd. And herein, if you can buy these stocks, I mean, again, decent balance sheets, because see, frankly, I don't know when the cycle will turn around. I am not good at predicting the turnaround of the cycle. My idea is to buy when I believe that the cycle is towards the very low end of it, although it could go further down. But yeah, I mean, at least it seems like that the companies have done badly, the markets are not interested. And therein I have realized you could get a cyclical growth opportunity of 2-3 years wherein the stocks could go up by 200, 300, even like 500, 800 odd % in 3 years. So that cyclical growth is also something that we track and try to participate in.
But like a question I had relating to that is that when do you exit these cyclical stocks? Because what I have seen is that like once the cycle turns and these stocks start rising up, suddenly everyone is talking about them and people are saying that it's best to hold them because they go further up. Something that happened with metals after 2020. So how do you look at exiting these investments? What is your idea behind that?
Yeah, so the easier part is entering. That's what we have realized. And this part is definitely difficult. Exit in any case, I mean, be it secular growth stories, cyclical growth is difficult. I mean, the thing with the market is that there will always be regret. If you exit too soon and if the stocks rise up, there'll be regret. If you don't exit and the stocks start falling, you'll regret. So, and as you pointed out with say metals, I mean, what happens is earlier there was no talk about metals. Now suddenly everyone is talking about metals. Okay, this is a super cycle now for metals. Frankly, I don't know what is a super cycle or whether there will be a super cycle. But herein comes a point wherein you decide, okay, at least that's what we have tried to follow is a trailing stop loss strategy or what we call as profit protection strategy. Right. So, I mean, we are looking at the trends of the stocks beyond a point because we don't just want to exit at any point of time because we don't know how long the cycle will continue. But then we have formed a rule. Okay, we are also kind of looking at chart patterns to a certain extent as to, and so that's what we have tried to determine and try to put up a stop loss kind of a strategy. Okay, if the stocks come below this point, I'll exit my stock. No questions asked. So I have already like say made 200, 300 odd % return on the stock. I don't know what the future course will be, whether it will be a super cycle or not, or whether this is a peak. But based on say certain chart patterns, or even like looking at the performance of the company. So I'll again, as I was said, in the case of metals, a year back or say 2 years back, some of the companies were reporting losses. Now they have started reporting super normal profits. I mean, from almost like 30 odd %. And if you again look at 10-year history, so those have happened twice or thrice in the last 10 years. And again, the cycles have reversed. So fundamentally, my thought process is probably the cycle may have peaked fundamentally, but I don't know how long will this continue. So now I'm trying to incorporate a second filter, which is a trailing stop loss or profit protection strategy. So it could mean that the stock is quoting at 100, but my trailing stop loss is at 80. So instead of exiting at 100, I'll probably exit at 80. But the other way around to look at it is, if the stock goes up to 120, my trailing stop loss would move up to 100.
Got it. Now to talk about the second category of stocks, which are probably mid-cap, large-cap stocks, which are highly covered by institutions, brokerage reports, and all these kind of things. So my question is that how do you actually use brokerage reports when it comes to your own analysis? Because what I have seen is that different brokerage houses have different opinions, even on the same stock at the same point of time. And they come up with these calls regularly. They publish their reports freely. Even in newspapers, you see brokers making a call and analysts recommending certain stocks. So do you go through these reports in your own investment style? And if yes, how do you look at them and what value do you gain from them?
Yeah, so we definitely go through these reports, and luckily what has happened is that all these brokerage houses, they have also started coming out with reports on smaller and mid-cap companies a lot.
Okay.
So I wouldn't say that we are looking at their report for large caps. What we are basically looking at is if there is a stock that we are looking at, or if there is a certain sector that we are looking at, if they have some reports on those segments or those companies or not. So the idea behind looking at these brokerage reports is not to get their opinion. The idea is only to get the information, because a lot of times, because of their overall network, because of their reach, because they have so many connections, the information that is there in those reports is quite valuable. So I mean, we also look at these credit rating reports, and those are in fact quite informative. But you don't have to use those credit rating reports for forming an opinion or taking their opinion about their rating. Similarly, we don't use brokerage reports in terms of taking their opinion on the stock. But we get loads of information on the company or the sector which we may not have access to sometimes. So that's how we use these brokerage reports. I mean, we could be reading 3 or 4 reports from brokerage reports on a particular company, and the idea is to just collect information and then form your own opinion. It's not about forming an opinion based on what they have suggested.
Got it. But one problem that I face while I am personally reading brokerage reports is that of confirmation bias. Like if I already have some kind of opinion, I actively look for data in that report or on the web that kind of validates my pre-existing opinion. Or even if, let's say, a brokerage report has come up with a buy rating, even the information that they present would be structured in a way to make things look very rosy for the company, and that's the good time to invest. So my question is, like, how do you separate signal from the noise and eliminate your own preconceived biases that you might have before you start even researching on that company?
See, I think the biases will always be there. We cannot completely eliminate the biases.
Hmm.
I think the only thing that I have tried to work upon is this counterintuitive approach. I mean, earlier I wouldn't say, even I had a lot of confirmatory biases and I made certain mistakes. But I read this book by Howard Marks, The Most Important Things Eliminated. And one thing that it drills down your mind is the concept of cycles. So each and everything is all, I mean, the economy is cyclical, the markets are cyclical, the businesses are cyclical. So, I mean, even the great businesses are cyclical. Obviously, there are certain very highly cyclical businesses like commodities, metals, and whatever. Then there are some moderately cyclical businesses like autos, auto ancillaries. And then there are very low cyclical businesses, probably pharma, FMCG. But all these businesses are cyclical, right? Because when I even talked about like trying to find good companies during their bad phase. So even this concept came from the cyclical part that, I mean, you could buy companies which may be trading at humongous valuations right now because everything is going good. But there could come a point wherein suddenly there might be a drop in earnings or some other event may hit them. And you could buy them at reasonable valuations again because there's a temporary problem. So, I mean, if you start thinking in terms of cycles and you kind of develop this counterintuitive approach and this contrarian thinking, and you don't get too much swayed either by the negative news too much or even the positive news as well. I mean, you'll start taking everything with a pinch of salt, even if your own company which you are holding, I mean, invested in, there's too much positive news. Automatically, your mind will start thinking, what could go wrong with that company? So that kind of balances you, and it's also helpful because I mean that helps you in making investing decisions considering the overall cycle of the market. For instance, March 2020, the markets are correcting badly. There was COVID, I mean, something which we had never seen before. The factories were shut. You didn't know what would happen, but all you could think was, I mean, life will still go on, and if everything comes to an end, then even if you make whatever investment, it won't matter. But if things will start improving from here on, you have to make your investments, right? And similarly, now in 21, 22, when anything or everything is going up, you again start thinking what could go wrong. I mean, with these companies or with your investments, or how do you like manage your risk? So if you have that part, I think even when you're reading these brokerage reports and all, you'll probably remain grounded and take everything with a pinch of salt, be it positive news or negative news. So I think this counterintuitive approach or reading this book has really helped me a lot.
No, that's a great insight that you talk about, that being skeptical about what the mass media is saying and being counterintuitive just to protect your downside in every situation is something that definitely sounds.
Yeah, I mean, not getting too much optimistic as well, especially with markets is kind. I mean, obviously every investor is different. There are some investors who are like super bullish all the time, and they make great amounts of money. But for my nature, I am just like trying to keep myself balanced out there.
Got it. So, like diverting the conversation to a slightly different topic. So, since you talk about learning from super investors, so even when I'm on Twitter these days, like there are threads every day on what you can learn from Warren Buffett, from Howard Marks, from Seth Klarman, all these kind of stuff. And they have 10, 15, 20 pointers, and they're very good to read at. But after reading them, I don't really understand that how am I going to implement those, or how are those insights going to help me in my creating my own portfolio or my own investing mindset. So do you really think there is some way we can learn from these super investors? And if there is one way, what is that way to really learn from these legends when it comes to investing?
So I think the problem is this information overload, and everyone is talking about all these super investors and their points and everything. So investing or any field is like sports, right? So what happens in sports is you're told certain points by a coach, and then you go out in the field and then practice those points, right? You start hitting the ball. If you're playing tennis, you start hitting the ball. You just can't, you cannot keep learning how to swing and without like practicing the swing. So while reading all those points by great investors, everything is good. I mean, I've read, say, Howard Marks, even I have read all those things. But beyond a point, there comes a time wherein you have to start reading annual reports. You have to start reading the company's presentations. You have to start reading the con call transcripts. You have to start forming an opinion about the company and make an investment. Without investing, there won't be any learning at all. I mean, beat losses, beat winners, but until you start really like investing your own money, no matter how small that amount is, how big. I started with 1,000 rupees or 2,000 rupees. I mean, my first investment was. So that's where you, I mean, if there are losses in the company, if you're incurring losses on the company, you cut your losses. You learn how to cut your losses. You learn how to write winners, right? I mean, Warren Buffett could tell you to write your winners and cut your losses. But until you do that in your own portfolio, you won't learn it. So that's what my point is. I mean, you read all that stuff, but here comes a point. I mean, normally what I've seen with most of the people is that 80% of the time they are only trying to read this stuff and not doing the actual stuff or reading the annual reports or the con calls and presentations. My idea is beyond, there comes a time when you have to, 80% of your time should be spent on doing those things, on reading about the company, screening the companies based on the filters, and 20% on reading what Templeton or Warren Buffett has said. And then you start making investments. Once you do that, your learnings would be much, much bigger, would actually start getting bigger. And those would again be built on the same foundation that has been talked about, those super investors. But you'll have to add your own thing because you are different as an individual, right? You have, your personality is not same. Warren Buffett may talk about, say, concentrated portfolio. You may like a slightly diversified portfolio, right? So that's what I mean. You have to start practicing, start going on the field, and that involves making investments.
Got it. Makes sense. And even like, I think like when we talk about these investors, like people mostly talk about their successful investments or where they are right now and how they're managing their portfolio right now when they're already successful. But like when you delve deeper, you realize that even these super investors, when starting up, they also experimented with different things, did not have those concentrated portfolios that you talk about, or operated more flexibly than what they advocate right now from what they have learned. Like particularly in Warren Buffett case, like I was reading somewhere that like you can divide his lifestyle investment choices into 3 phases. Like early on when he was running his own partnership firm, like he was very bullish and took more riskier trades, did not just like operating more like a hedge fund rather than a pure play value investor who take very safe concentrated bets. So I think that is something that
So I mean, what is also important is that now he is managing like billions of dollars, 100, 200 or whatever billions of dollars. Here, if someone is starting, he's starting with a few thousands, few lakhs, right? So how could your investment style be same as Warren Buffett? The problem with Warren Buffett is that he cannot make so many transactions now. He cannot go into small micro cap company, right? With the amount of money that you had. But you can go there, right? You can invest in, you can experiment around. He also experimented and he developed his own strategy. In fact, he was quite aggressive in his earlier days and used to take control of the companies and make all those bets. So you should read that stuff, which is good. But overall, you'll have to develop your own investing style, and for that, you'll have to actually make investments. Be so however small it be. And over a period of time, 2 years, 3 years, and this investing style of yours will also like keep on changing to a certain extent. I mean, when you are starting, how can you really define, okay, I'll be a trader, I'll be investor, I'll be momentum investor, I'll be momentum trader or fundamental. I mean, you don't know what may suit your personality or what you may find where you, there are, at least I can say there are thousands ways of making money. So you don't have to really like think of, okay, this is the only way of making money.
What you're saying makes perfect sense, because personally, I did not have a lot of investing experience, but at our institute, what we have is a student-run investment fund wherein we pool money from the students, and we have a club that basically manages that money and invests that in the markets. And at the end of every year, we liquidate that fund and return the money to the students. So I was the fund manager in that fund, and this was my first professional experience of investing and creating a portfolio as such. So like I had read a lot of these books and read a lot about valuation and investing, but when I actually started investing with real money, like things turned out to be completely different than what you anticipated in your Excel sheet or what you anticipated in your mind that this is how things would work.
Right.
So even like, so at every point of time, like everything seems to be a paradox. Like if something is so good, you're like, maybe I'm too late to the party, it's not worth investing here. And if something is not that good but could become good, there's always that risk that it might not become good. So there's no certainty in investing, and that fear or that uncertainty when it comes to when you have your own skin in the game is certainly something that teaches you a lot.
Yeah, so the only thing certain about markets is that there is no certainty, because you are only analyzing the past, you know the present to a certain extent, but you are betting on the future. So I mean, as you pointed out, what might be really good right now may not be good some years down the line. Or similarly, what might be really bad right now could turn out to be really good. So you are betting on the uncertain things, but once you start betting, you kind of get some patterns, pattern recognition. You kind of get some hang of it. So again, as Templeton says, I mean, no matter how good you are, you will only be right probably 2/3 of the time. So you will be wrong probably 1/3 of the time. So if you are taking 10 investment decisions, 6 or 7 will be right, and if 6 and 7 are good, right, you still end up making a lot of money, because ultimately what you can lose unless your leverage is the 100%, and even that 100 you don't lose those 100%, right? But what you could accrue on your good investments is like 200, 300,000% or whatever. So there will always be a lot of people, what they fear with respect to markets or decisions is that they fear suddenly start getting fearful when things go wrong. But it's only over a period of time when you have made a few decisions, some went right, some went wrong, you start getting a hang of it.
So another question that just popped into my mind is, so you said when like others get fearful, you should actually take a counterintuitive stance and see if things can get better going forward. But what if it is the other way around, when people are greedy and markets are at an all-time high and you feel that almost all valuations are stretched? What strategy do you personally advocate? Like, do you consider waiting out of the market and waiting for a downturn and then entering, or you're like, at least stay invested in the market and let's see where it goes?
I think the first strategy doesn't work at all. I mean, at least for me, I'm not good with timing, and the markets, as they say, can remain elevated, irrational for very long periods of time. And you cannot stay out of, at least I cannot stay out of the market. I have to have my foot in the door. Because if you say completely out of the market, I mean, it can never be 100 or 0, right? Because if you're completely out of the market, even when things start going down, you won't have that ability in general, at least I won't have, to pump in all my money. I mean, so what my feeling is that, I mean, for me, if I'm feeling that the markets are really high, I could still be invested 70, 75, 80 odd %, or I may have certain stocks, as I talked about, certain cyclical stocks, wherein they are still, wherein I'm riding the growth part. But if things do turn north, I'll have some exit strategy wherein certain money will automatically come out of the markets, and I'll have more liquidity to deploy or more cash to deploy. But being, at least for me, being completely out of the market doesn't work. And I would rather be invested and see drawdowns to a certain extent than be completely out. And I'm sure if I'm completely out, I'll miss out on investing during corrections as well. Because when you're trying to over predict or over time the market, now you tend to get into that loop wherein you're always trying to predict, okay, this is the peak or this is the bottom. And
got it. Makes
so it doesn't work out for me.
Another aspect of your investment strategy that is also captured in your Alpha Plus small case fund is certain allocation of the portfolio to special situations. So what are these special situations? Like, how do you get to know of them? How do you keep track of them? If you can just like briefly describe your investment strategy around that.
Yeah, so it's a good space. I think it wasn't frankly talked about so much. It's now being talked about a lot now on Twitter and all. So special situation is basically nothing there. How we look at it is basically a corporate action or event, right? That might be happening in the company, which we believe could result in value unlocking. So basically, it's more as a trigger which enables the company to unlock the value, or we as shareholders to get value out of it. So over the last many 10, 12 odd years, I have like personally invested in 2, 3 kinds of special situations. I mean, there are a lot of other good investors who do all kind of special situations, but I have normally worked in delistings, buybacks, and demergers. So I think when you talk about demerger, the best case that comes to mind is the demerger of Reliance Industries back in probably what 2005-6, when there was a dispute between brothers, and before that we all knew about their oil business, but not many knew about, and their telecom business, but we did not know much about their other businesses. And when that demerger happened, the oil business went separate, and there were so many businesses that created, and I think that created a lot of wealth for investors. So it was basically like a lot of things were hidden before the demerger, but the demerger acted as a trigger wherein all the layers of business started opening up, and that led to value unlocking. So demerger is that thing. I mean, wherein we participate. Uh, I'll also talk about what happens is that we talk about value investing, and a lot of times you don't know how things will work out. A 100 crore asset could remain valued at 50, 60 crore for long periods without, but demerger in such cases could act as a trigger or a catalyst which could enable this fast unlocking of value, wherein suddenly all the investors start looking at, okay, this was a business there which has more value, which wasn't being captured. And again, what could happen is that there might be two businesses in the company. One could be very good, other could be really bad, which might be like reporting losses. But the good business value earnings were getting overshadowed because of the losses of a bad business. So if there is a business with 10 crore profit, another business with 9 crore loss, the overall company is making 1 crore profit. But when you separate these two businesses, the 10 crore business will start getting much bigger value. While obviously the minus 9 crore losses one won't get zero value by the market or negative value by the market. So this is what happens in demerger. It comes with certain timelines. You have to follow the timelines because there are approvals involved by shareholders, lenders, then NCLT approval, and you have a certain well-defined timeline in general. Then we also participated a lot in delistings. So delisting is a very simple concept. You have all these companies listed, and one day the promoters decide, okay, I don't want to remain listed. There is too much compliance. There's too much reporting that we have to do. And there are also sometimes other motives behind when the promoters decide to delist. So they come out with an offer. Okay, I'll buy out the stake from the public shareholders. Right now the stock might be quoting at say 200. And then the shareholders determine at what price they would like to tender their shares. So it's a reverse book building process where tendering by shareholders happen, and there's a mechanism for determining the price. Ultimately, the promoters decide whether they find the price viable enough for them to. So what we have observed here again is a promoter is say holding 60 odd % in the company. Why would he wish to go to 100%? So probably he's seeing some value in the company or something unfolding in terms of posture in the sector or the company over the next 2-3 years. That's why he's willing to pay a certain additional amount and buy out the remaining 40% or 30% or 20%. So again, you get a trigger wherein the shareholders get an option to like determine at what price they would like to do. In fact, we have tried to play it the other way as well, wherein the delisting has failed. But then, as I said, when you look at, we have looked at certain cases in the past wherein when the delisting failed, but the company eventually did well over the next 2-3 years because the sector turned around. Or what may have happened is when the promoters came up with the delisting offer, the sector was doing so bad that the stock was at rock bottom prices, and then the turnaround happened. So the other way is, even when the delisting doesn't happen, you could still look at if there is some potential for the value to unlock because of some expected change in the fate of the company or the sector.
Got it.
But again, this space is getting crowded a bit.
Got it. So I have a question around the power of compounding. So we all have read books about it, and we all understand the maths behind it, that if you earn a consistent return over a longer period of time, your wealth will compound exponentially. But implementing it in real life is a challenge, which is something that I have been struggling with as well, because the payoffs are so long term. Like if I'm seeing a short term return of, let's say, 15, 20, 30, even 50 odd percent, I'm more tempted to sell that investment and book that profit instead of probably holding it off for the next 10 years if I believe that it's a fundamentally strong company. So coming from your experience, where you have been investing since a very early stage and you have been managing your own firm for more than 10 years now. So how do you attune your own mind and investment strategy to harness this power of compounding?
I think probably it has come easier for me. I mean, I understand the fact, although I try and explain it to a lot of people, why is it so difficult for you to hold a stock?
Mm-hmm.
So as I told you, my father had been investing, and he used to talk about this company which had like delivered 50x, 100x returns over so many years. So this is something that got ingrained in my mind. Okay, that if the business is good, if the company is delivering, stocks, they have this potential to become 50x, 100x as well. I mean, it doesn't happen very often, and it isn't as easy as it is sounding right now. But yeah, there are companies that could go on to deliver those values. So for me, I mean, most of the time, again, when you are investing, you have to determine why you are investing actually. See, the problem with most of the investors is they just jump into the market, because jumping into the markets, opening a trading account is very easy. It's the simplest thing to do. In fact, much more easier now. And then they start buying stocks. But unless you're determined as to why you are buying the stock, how will you decide as to why you are holding it, or how long will you hold it, and when will you sell it? Right. So when I'm buying a cyclical stock, I have a certain strategy already in mind. Okay, that this is a low point. There will be a point when things will peak out, and therein my strategy would be to hold it for say 1-2 years, or when I believe it might be peaking out. But when I'm looking at a secular growth story where I believe the earnings potential or there's a long runway ahead for the company, or if I believe there could be re-rating, so why would I exit at 15, 20% or 30%? I mean, appreciation in the stock. If I believe that the company is doing well and it has potential to do well, and if I'm going deeper into the company, like listening to the con calls of the management, why would I exit? Why would I get an urge? So I think normally people get this urges because they haven't done that homework as to why they're buying the stock. Once you're determined why you're buying the stock, you'll have some idea as to why you will sell it.
So I think that's a fair point. So what you're trying to say is that most of the retail investors enter the market without any real sense of what their investment objective is. Like, are they doing this for the long run, or do they want some short-term doubling of money or excitement, or just for fun? Like, so this is something
that basically you have to determine your destination, your goal. I mean, if you have to go from Kanpur to Delhi, why would you jump off at say Tawa? I mean, right?
Makes sense.
So when you have like decided, okay, this is my goal is wealth accumulation, wealth generation, you'll decide accordingly. But if you just jump in randomly, then again your selling will also be random.
Got it. One question I had around was, so this new thing called small cases has come up in the recent past, and you are there, you are offering 2 funds there, and a lot of other people have their different funds categorized to different specialties there. And the way I see it is that it offers you much more specialization and flexibility that is not offered in mutual funds, which are much more restricted and have fewer options to choose from. But something that I want to know your opinion on is how to approach investing in small cases. Especially, I know a lot of people in my family who are working professionals who have a lot of savings, who want to invest in the markets, but they don't have the time to go through each company or read annual reports or read con calls. So they have a lot of investments in mutual funds or gold or fixed deposits even. But they struggle when it comes to investing in small cases, that how exactly to approach this platform. So can you share your thoughts on how an investor who has some money to dispose of can use small cases as a platform to better his return on savings?
So first thing first, I mean, I recommend these mutual funds to, I mean, at least I am not a mutual fund advisor, but I mean, a lot of people find it as boring somehow. But for 98%, 99% of the people, mutual fund is still one of the best vehicles for investment. And yeah, and as far as small case goes, again, it's kind of a similar strategy. You have to first of all determine what is your objective, what's your goal is. I mean, there are probably like hundreds of small cases now, or probably hundreds of advisors and analysts on small case, and they have different strategies. So probably there are 300 odd different kinds of small cases. So, I mean, you'll have to determine what's your purpose of investing in a small case. Whether it's for small trading gains, then you automatically look for those kind of small cases. If you have your strategy is wealth creation, long-term wealth accumulation, you could be looking at guys who have been in this business or advisors in this space, or whose strategy, I mean, at least your thought process is aligned with his strategy, or if you have checked his track record of fundamental investing. So you kind of go with that. Or if you believe in, say, a certain strategy, okay, this strategy works. Like, I believe there are a lot of momentum-based strategy, based small cases that are there, which are doing good job of. So you choose those kind of small cases, and then you have to also determine your asset allocation as well. I mean, there are 100 rupees with you. You have to determine what part of it will go for, say, momentum based or value based. So unless you have done that kind of homework in your mind, I mean, again, it will all be very random, just like it would be random in terms of picking mutual funds. I mean, a lot of people, what they do with respect to mutual funds, whatever new funds are being launched, new sector based funds, they go for those. But that's not the right way, right? Or a lot of people, what they do is they go for the funds that are delivering the best performance in this year, right? But that again is not the right way in general to go for, because that could become the worst performer the next year. So you have to look at consistency, or you have to align with if you like the fund manager or not, or if you like what their aim is, whether it's a small cap based or mid cap or large cap based. So those are the things you have to first work out in your mind, or talk about with your advisor. And only then you could take the next step of, it's again like choosing a stock, right? Or like determining what exactly is your thought process, or what exactly is plan. Unless you have done that kind of work, you won't beat stocks, beat mutual funds, or beat small cases. It won't work. You cannot just randomly, or I mean, there might be some offer by some small case manager, so you won't just pick up that because he's offering you some 20% discount, right? Because it's not about 20% discount, it's about overall wealth creation on whatever funds you are investing. So you have to get things clear in your mind before making these decisions.
So having a sense of your personal financial plan, financial objectives, and how do you want your investments to kind of link with your financial objectives in life is what is important in the first place. And then you decide the right instrument that helps you meet those objectives.
Again, very simple. If you have to go from here, I mean, from Kanpur to, say, Srinagar, will you take a car or will you take a flight or what? So, I mean, first you have to determine what your destination is or what your goal is, and then you choose an instrument on the way to the same, rather than just simply you won't, okay, chalo car se chalte hain. You won't do that way, no?
Makes sense. So you need to have an understanding of what time duration you are looking at, what is your risk appetite.
Investing, I mean, somehow investing has become so talked about on Instagram or whatever, or YouTube. But I mean, it's an integral part, just like your health. And I mean, a lot of people take it very lightly and be very careless about it. But I mean, I just keep telling everyone the most important component in compounding equation is T, because it's exponentially raised. And if you start looking at certain, I mean, those who start at 20, 25, no matter how small an amount, and someone who starts at 35, I mean, it just becomes so much difficult for that person who starts at 35 to catch up with the person who started at 22 or 20, irrespective of the small amount. So get these things in your mind clear, and you can make loads of money, frankly.
Got it. Makes sense. So one final question before we call it a wrap, and this is on a slightly different tangent. So, like, even though you had a family background in investing and you had that family support and knowledge to bank upon, but it's always a tough decision to start your own firm right after your graduation, and it's kind of an entrepreneurial venture, and especially in markets where everything is uncertain and you are also starting up on your own. So how was this journey like? How did you decide to start Catalyst Wealth? What are your key learnings have been, especially from an entrepreneurial perspective, in the last 10 years?
So I won't say I ever decided that I'll do this. Things just happened automatically, frankly. So, I mean, financially, we were doing extremely bad in 2008-9. I mean, very bad, in fact.
Due to the crisis.
Yeah, due to the crisis, we had run out of all our securities, everything, all our stocks. But I had my interest in stock market. I had lost interest in BTech. I had started researching on stocks. I started very small sums. And since I was researching on stocks, very small companies, there was a small outfit based in Bangalore who was looking to hire, who could share notes or create blogs or reports on small micro cap companies. I just approached them randomly, told them I'm still a third year BTech student, but luckily they hired me and they asked me to write reports, notes. So I started earning some money. So in fact, that helped a lot. By the end of fourth year, yeah, I got some placement. I mean, just like everyone in BTech does. I mean, you get placed in Infosys. So I got that placement. But since I was working with that firm, I moved to Bangalore for a year. But yeah, and I did not ever think that I'll start Catalyst Wealth. But again, something happened. I did not like whatever it was, and I just quit in 2011, just after 1 year after my college. And somehow I thought, okay, I mean, I have some experience. I have been like helping investors. And frankly, I mean, I wanted to make my own investments. I'm very passionate about it. But how do I generate capital for that? So I thought, okay, I'll start offering my own research because I had already been doing it for the past 2 years. And that's how just capital. And frankly, I mean, we are now in a world, internet-based economy, internet-based world where you can start with a lot of things without much capital, wherein your intellectual capital is itself can help you generate your business. And so, yeah, I mean, in 2011, because I needed capital for my own investment, I started this Catalyst Wealth. And luckily, from the first or second month itself, it ensured that I could take care of my expenses. I could take care of my family expenses to a certain extent. And at the same time, generate additional amount to make my investments, which are bad. And since then, luckily, it's been decent enough. I mean, it surely has helped me grow my investments a lot. It surely has helped me generate good amount of capital. And I think a lot of clients have also benefited a lot because we have a lot of clients who have been with us since we started in 2011.
Got it.
So let's see.
Yeah. For one final question, so what is one advice you would have given to your younger self in 2011 as you were starting up this venture? So yeah, now looking back, I think I have a lot of issues. I'm not so good as a manager. I mean, I'm not so good. I mean, I would say I can do very well individually, but probably better networking or social skills. I don't know. I mean, I think these things help you a lot in business. And yeah, just, I mean, try have a big vision and be disciplined about it. But yeah, I've been disciplined, I would say, and vision wise, I think it's okay. But I think more in terms of improving your ability. If you are running a business, you should be a good manager in general. So I think I could have scaled it up a lot better, which I'm not trying to do further, and especially in the last 2 years. Yeah, so I mean, a certain issues with my own nature, I would say, more like introvert, frankly, or whatever, not so good manager. So I would try and improve upon those. Got it. But I won't say I lack in dedication or discipline. So that's there. But yeah, maybe those skills could help you really in scaling up your business a lot. Definitely. And going by your Twitter following, I think you have really made an impact there. And you are quite popular now, at least when it comes to investing stuff. Yeah.
Even we started only in the last few months or so. We were not very active at all. We just looked at it as any platform. But then we thought, okay, now we have to grow. We have to make use of all the platforms all there. And when we are already doing so much research, why just not put it out there and help investors as well? So
exactly. And to be honest, like I see people without any due diligence, without any credentials or research to back them up, going so popular on social media and giving out free advice. So we really need people like you who have that kind of experience and credentials to actually help investors in a much more practical sense.
The only problem right now is what happens is that when you're registered with SEBI, there are certain restrictions and limitations, which a lot of people who are not registered and who are not. So that creates a hurdle, but otherwise, yeah, it's okay. I mean, you could still create value for all your readers and followers, and that's what we are trying to do.
Definitely. And I would also urge all my listeners to follow Catalyst Wealth on Twitter, because like you come up with a lot of insights as well as threads on investing, learning from mistakes, and especially about special situations and all these kind of investing philosophies that you follow. So thanks a lot, Akansh, for your time. I think this has been a great session and it would be a great value addition. It has been a great value addition for me, and I hope it would be for the listeners as well. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Prabal. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me on your platform. And I hope it does add value to all your listeners and viewers.
Definitely. Thanks a lot. And this is a wrap from our end.